Chapter 19. You will be executed by a firing squad. On a soldier's radio in the hospital where he was working, Alphonse heard the news of Adolf Hitler's death. At first I thought my God had died fighting the Soviets, but when I learned it was suicide, I did not think any less of him. Death was certainly better than the fate that would have awaited him. He had fought on, as he promised, until the very end. Nazi Germany, my Germany, perished with Hitler. Our dreams of power and glory were over. We were slaves now, headed into a never-ending darkness. As ordered, Alphonse had turned himself in when the next unit of American troops entered Wittlich. Again, his knowledge of English had saved him. He was put to work in a hospital translating orders from American officers to the German workers. Conditions in the hospital were good. For a while, the workers lived better than most other Germans. They had all they wanted to eat at a time when many people were near starvation. At first, the American occupiers were too busy restoring electrical power, phone service, and transportation lines to worry about hunting for Nazis. But when these chores were done, the search began. During the war, only a few citizens of Wittlich had been strongly anti-Nazi. Now, however, many claimed to have hated Hitler and the Third Reich. All over town, people were pointing fingers and accusing each other. By informing on their neighbors, they hoped to win the favor of their American captors. Alphonse was among those who were accused. Someone told on me, and word of it got back to the captain in charge of the hospital. Immediately, I lost my job. "I don't need any fanatic Hitler Youth members stinking up the place," the captain yelled angrily at me. "Get out of here, but don't leave town. You're still a prisoner. We'll get to you soon." Fortunately for many Hitler Youth leaders, our age protected us. Since you had to be 18 to join the Nazi Party, Americans often overlooked the teenagers in search for Nazis. They saw us merely as misguided children, not realizing that we had been far more fanatic than the average party member. I was glad that they seemed blind to us, but I also knew that my time was running out. After losing his job, Alphonse spent his days helping his grandmother and aunts clear rubble from the family farm. Using only their hands and the single wooden wheelbarrow that had survived, they worked endless days clearing the farm and the charred fields. Uncle Hornung kept them alive by bringing potatoes and some lard from his farm a few miles away. But since he wasn't allowed to take the horses out of his own village, the plowing of the fields had to be done by hand. The Hecks were not alone. Across Germany, millions of rubble women began the massive task of rebuilding their homes. The job fell to women and children because many of the men were now dead, injured, or prisoners of war. Slowly and patiently, billions of bricks were scraped and cleaned. Boards were straightened and stacked as the tremendous job of cleaning up from the war began. Twice each week, Alphonse had to report to an American officer. Unlike most citizens, he could not leave town, but he had stopped worrying that he would be held prisoner of war. Other Wittlich teenagers who had served the Wehrmacht had not been sent to POW camps. Still, he had to admit they had not been high-ranking Hitler Youth leaders. The officer to whom Alphonse reported was a friendly young soldier from Minnesota. One day at check-in, he invited Alphonse to stay for coffee, and soon the two became friends. During one of their visits, Alphonse asked the lieutenant if he hated all Germans. "No way," he replied. "You people have some terrific qualities, but you also scare me. How could you have fallen for that maniac Hitler? And even worse, how could you allow that creep to murder millions of Jews?" "Oh, come on, Lieutenant," I said. "You don't really believe your own horror stories, do you?" It was one of the few times I saw him honestly mad. "Do you think we faked these pictures?" he screamed at me, referring to photos of the death camps. "Those murders are a burden you'll never shake off in your lifetime." To my sorrow, I later found out he was right, but at the time, I didn't believe him. Many other Germans did not believe the stories that were coming out of the concentration camps. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, commander of the Allied troops, led American liberators into Ordorf, the first German camp to be liberated. What he saw shocked him so much that he sent hurried messages to London and the United States, asking journalists and government leaders to come at once to see for themselves. So enraged was Eisenhower that he ordered German residents of Ordorf to come with him to see the starved prisoners and the stacks of corpses at the camp. The sight sickened the people. The town's mayor and his wife were so upset they went home and hanged themselves. One of the American journalists who visited the camps was Life magazine photographer Margaret Burke White. Burke White was with General Patton and the American Third Army when they liberated Buchenwald in central Germany. She later wrote about that day. I saw and photographed the piles of naked, lifeless bodies, the human skeletons in the furnaces, the living skeletons who would die the next day because they had to wait too long for help, the pieces of tattooed skin for lampshades. Using the camera was almost a relief. It put a barrier between myself and the horror in front of me. Like Eisenhower, General Patton also made the townspeople come to the camp to witness the awful sight. Burke White was there to photograph the expressions on the German faces and to listen to the gasps of disbelief. This was the first time, she recalled, that I heard the words I was to hear repeated thousands of times. We didn't know. We didn't know. But they did know. An old English proverb warns, "There are none so blind to those who will not see." This was the crime that millions of Germans now found themselves accused. Did they know? Had they seen what went on in the camps and yet chosen to remain silent? These questions will remain forever unanswered. At the moment, however, there was no time for guilt. During the summer of 1945, Alphonse and most other Germans were too busy rebuilding their lives to search their souls. There was more immediate burdens to be faced. American troops were preparing to leave. Soon, the French would take over as occupiers. Life under the Americans had been bearable, but for many generations there had been hard feelings between the French and the Germans. Under their new French occupiers, the Germans knew they could expect no mercy. The French arrived in force on July 5th, with blaring bugles and white belts. Some were on bicycles. The very next morning, an officer and 2 soldiers appeared at the farm. Like evil spirits in the midst of our rubble, clad only in an undershirt and cut-off pants, my sweating face streaked with dirt, I was arrested and herded down Main Street of town on foot, my grandmother wailing mournfully after me. The soldiers were anything but gentle. By the time they shoved me through the main gate of the Wittlich Penitentiary, my backside was black and blue from the blows of their rifle butts. A captain, cigarette dangling from his mouth, checked my name off a long list. "Eck, Alphonse," he growled. "Hitler Youth Leader?" I nodded, numb with pain. "Bon," he said. "Nazi bullshit." Minutes later, I was shoved into a large cell with more than 24 men. All were Nazi Party members. There were 4 or 5 Hitler Youth leaders, none from Wittlich. It looked like time had run out for Alphonse. Age made no difference to the French occupiers. If you'd been a Hitler Youth leader, you faced a harsh sentence. Unlike the Americans, the French had had their homeland invaded by the Nazis, and they intended to seek revenge. Outside the cold stone fortress where Alphonse now sat were the gentle forested hills of Wittlich. Before the war, this land had been ripe with vineyards, their grapes producing the fine white wine for which the Mosel region was well known. Now the sorry remains of the vines poked through the blackness of the devastated earth. How fast it had all happened. Just yesterday, it seemed he had been working with his uncles and his grandmother in those fields and vineyards, a boy with a bright, promising future. Now, sitting in a large barred cage in the penitentiary on benches bolted to the floor, he had no future at all. His world was dead, just as he himself might soon be. His ID card showed that he was just 17, yet in his mind and spirit he was an old man. Shortly before 6 p.m., a captain and 3 soldiers armed with submachine guns stepped up to our cage. In broken German, the captain read a few sentences from a paper he was holding. The last one hit me as if I had been kicked in the stomach. By order of the French military government in Germany, you will be executed by a firing squad tomorrow morning at 600 hours to pay for your crimes committed in France. I will never forget the deadly silence or ashen faces of my fellow prisoners as we stared at each other. Some sank down on benches and clapped their hands in front of their faces. One reached for my hand. "Can they do this?" I asked, shaken. "Who's going to stop them?" Somebody laughed hoarsely. No words can express the terror of a man condemned to die. All talking stopped as each of us battled with our own emotions. I cried silently at times, and I prayed, and I went through a rage of self-pity. Why me? What have I done? I asked myself. It was then, for the first time, that I felt betrayed by the man who had become my God. But this God was dead, along with 2.5 million young German teenagers who had worshipped him. Left behind to bear the tremendous burden of what their God had created were the remnants of Germany's youth, a handful of teens like Alphonse who had been turned into old men by the nightmare of the last few years. It was they, the living, who would carry the blame for the horrors of Hitler's Third Reich. That night, I decided that we, the young fanatics of the Hitler Youth, had also become the Führer's victims. I'm sure my terror in the hours before my execution was every bit as horrible as the fear of a concentration camp prisoner about to enter the gas chamber. But in the end, I was spared, and that, after all, is what counts. Toward midnight, I called to a German-speaking French soldier who seemed a little less harsh than the others. This man smiled occasionally and handed out cigarettes freely. "Could you please arrange for some of us to see a priest?" I asked him. "I would like to go to confession." He nodded, turned around, and came back, motioning for me to come closer to the bars. "Don't worry much," he whispered. "You won't be shot. Not yet, anyway. The captain wanted to have some fun with you." Then he put his finger over his lips and cautioned. "Silence, please. I could be in trouble for telling you this." I never knew that soldier's name and never saw him again after that night, but I still think of him as one of my few true friends. The soldier had told the truth. The next morning, Alphonse was led into a small cell completely alone. This was solitary confinement. For nearly 2 weeks, no one spoke to him. On the afternoon of the 12th day, he was taken into an office where a captain sat, cracking a horsewhip. Reminding Alphonse that he was still a prisoner, the officer told him that he could leave the cell as long as he stayed in Wittlich and reported to City Hall each Monday. "If you try to leave town," the captain reminded him, "you will be shot. And heck, we'll deal with you again." True to their word, the French kept track of me. In October, I was ordered to report to a board of men who would decide my sentence. One of the men wanted to put me in jail for life. But fortunately, the rest were not as harsh. They told me not to leave town for 2 years, nor could I go to school for 6 months, if it should reopen. In addition, I was ordered to work 1 month at hard labor for the French military government. The hard labor was the worst part. One of our jobs was to dig up a mass grave where French prisoners of war had been buried after the bombing raid on Wittlich in January. By the time we finished digging the fresh graves of each of the victims, I had vomited several times. The French also ordered us to watch films of the death camps in Poland. 2 friends from my former Gefolgschaft were there with me. Unfortunately, the films had just the opposite effect on us than our captors expected. When we saw the piles of corpses and the pictures of the dead and dying prisoners, we simply refused to believe them. These photos were obviously fakes, taken to make us feel guilty. They could not possibly be real. The French were outraged by our attitude and beat us severely with their rifle butts, but nothing they did changed our minds. It would be many months before I could bring myself to believe the truth about the Holocaust. It would be many years before I could speak or write about it.